Diesel stopped walking 17 steps into the tree line. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply planted all 4 paws in the frozen pine needles and pointed, ears rigid, neck extended, body locked into the specific total stillness that Ethan Cole had learned to read the way other men read faces. Not the stillness of uncertainty, the stillness of certainty. Diesel had found something. Ethan stopped beside him and looked where the dog was looking, which was northwest, deeper into the tree line, toward a part of the Keller property that Ethan had not known was there. He could not see anything through the pine trunks, but the long, flat gray of a November morning in northern Montana. He could hear, barely, a sound that was either whine through the branches or something else entirely. Diesel's hackles rose along his spine like a slow wave, then settled. He did not look up at Ethan. He kept his eyes on the tree line. His left forepaw lifted, held for a moment, came down. He had done this exact sequence in a village outside Kandahar in 2019 when he had located a man trapped in a collapsed structure that the whole team had walked past 3 times. Ethan had learned then what the sequence meant. He looked at the dog, and the dog held his gaze for 1 second. A single, clear transmission, and then turned back toward the northwest and began to move. Ethan followed. He had no idea what was in those trees. He would understand later. What he found in that shed would leave the entire town of Granger, Montana, without words for a very long time. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from tonight. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and follow it all the way to the end. What Diesel pulled Ethan toward in those trees, and what had been hidden there, and what had been done to the man inside, is the kind of story that changes how you see the world when it's over. Ethan Cole was 40 years old and had the kind of face that people in small towns called honest, which was not quite the right word, but was the closest available one for the quality they were actually observing: the complete absence of performance. He did not arrange his expression. He was simply, at all times, entirely present, which some people found comfortable and some people found unsettling, and which was in either case entirely outside his control, because it was simply how he had been made. He was 5'11" and 183 pounds, with close-cropped dark hair and brown eyes that people described, after a moment's consideration, as the color of earth after rain. Not dramatic, not remarkable, but the kind of color that is specifically and permanently trustworthy in the way that earth is trustworthy. His left orbital ridge carried a faint ridge of healed bone from a vehicle rollover outside Kandahar that had ended his final deployment. He moved with a deliberateness that was not slowness. He could move very fast when fast was required. But that was the expression of a man who had concluded that most situations reward attention over speed, and who had trained that conclusion into his body over 12 years, until it became the only way he knew how to exist in the world. He had served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps as a staff sergeant with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. 3 deployments: Fallujah in 2010, Helmand Province in 2013, and Kandahar in 2019, where the vehicle rollover had fractured his left orbital ridge and partially separated his right shoulder, and produced, on the flight home from Bagram, a very clear understanding that his body had been telling him something for 2 years, and that ignoring it was over. He had separated with an honorable discharge in 2020 and moved to Granger, Montana, a town of 4,200 in the Flathead River Valley, because his grandmother had left him a small house there, and because the idea of a place he did not need to explain himself to had become the only idea he could hold on to with any conviction. He did community maintenance work for the county. He ran the roads in the morning. He kept to himself without being unfriendly about it, which Granger recognized and respected. He had Diesel. And that, most days, was the right number of constants to build a life around. Diesel was 6 years old and looked, at rest, like something carved from dark timber, all density and shadow, with a coat so deeply saturated in black and rich mahogany tan that in low light he appeared almost entirely dark, only the tan showing at the edges of his face and legs and the underside of his chest like light coming through at the borders of a closed door. He weighed 91 pounds, every ounce of it the kind of muscle built not from training alone, but from years of genuine use and genuinely difficult conditions. His right ear was intact and mobile, rotating in constant small arcs, always receiving, never still. His left ear had a deep, clean V-notch cut from the last 2 inches of the tip, where structural wire had caught it during a building search in Helmand in 2013. The same deployment, the same province, where Ethan had been operating 40 kilometers to the north, which neither of them had known until the adoption paperwork came through and Ethan had read the service record and sat for a long moment in his grandmother's kitchen thinking about the particular way the world arranges coincidences that are not quite coincidences. Diesel moved with a quality of attention so complete that people in his vicinity tended, without meaning to lower their voices and mean what they said. He had been attached to 3 handlers across his service years and had been professional with all of them. Then Ethan had come, and the dog had simply decided, without ceremony, that this was the person, and had organized everything else around that decision with a total, unself-conscious commitment available only to animals and to men who have stopped pretending. The Keller property ran 240 acres along the eastern slope of a low ridge at the edge of Granger's northern boundary, mostly timber with a cleared section near the road where a farmhouse had stood until a fire in 2004 had reduced it to a foundation and a scatter of charred lumber that the snow covered in winter and the weeds reclaimed every spring. The county had assessed the land as unoccupied. The tax records showed the same. The property had been in the Keller family since 1961, and the last known Keller, a man named Thomas, Vietnam veteran born 1951, had not been seen in Granger in over 3 years. His mail still arrived at the county post office box he had maintained since before the fire. Most of it went uncollected. Nobody had asked why. That was the detail that would stay with Ethan longest. Not what he found in the shed, but the fact of the uncollected mail, and the 3 years of silence, and the number of people in Granger who had known Thomas Keller's name and had not gone to find out what had become of it. He and Diesel had been running the Tree Line Road on the northern edge of town, a route Ethan had been running for 2 years because it was flat and quiet, and the pines cut the wind when Diesel had left the road. Not gradually, not tentatively. He had simply turned left into the tree line at a point that Ethan had passed 200 times without looking twice at, and had walked 17 steps and stopped. The shed was 80 yards into the trees, not visible from the road. It had been built from salvaged lumber after the fire, rough and low, with a corrugated metal roof rusted to the color of dried blood, and a single south wall window covered from inside with a flattened cardboard box. There was smoke. A thin thread of it from a stovepipe through the roof, installed at an angle that suggested one person working alone without the right tools. The smoke smelled of green wood burning slowly, inadequate heat from a fire being managed by someone rationing what they had. Diesel walked to the door of the shed and lay down flat in front of it. He did not bark. He looked back at Ethan once, and the look was not alarm. It was the dog equivalent of a hand placed on a shoulder. Something is here. Go carefully. Go slowly. Ethan knocked on the door. A long silence. Then a sound from inside, not a voice, exactly, but the sound of a person who has been sleeping and is not certain whether what they heard was real. Ethan said, through the door, "My name is Ethan Cole. I live in town. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to know you're okay." Another silence. Then, from inside, in a voice that had the quality of something that had not been used in some time, "I'm okay." The voice did not sound okay. "Can I come in?" Ethan said. The door opened inward after a moment's hesitation, and Thomas Keller stood in the doorway of his shed in the gray November morning and looked at Ethan Cole and at the dog lying flat on the frozen ground in front of the threshold with its chin on its paws, and his face did the thing faces do when they have been alone for so long that the presence of another person requires a moment of calibration. He was 72 years old. He was thin in the way that is not a body type, but a condition. The thinness of a man who has been eating less than he needs for long enough that the bones have begun to show through the skin in new places. His white hair was long and had been cut by himself unevenly at some point in the past several months. His hands, when he gripped the doorframe, were the hands of a man who had spent 50 years doing physical labor, thick-knuckled, calloused, carrying the specific topography of a life lived in contact with tools and timber and ground. His eyes were pale blue, light-colored in the way of people from Northern European stock, and they were, despite everything, despite the thinness and the shed and the green wood smoke and the 3 years of silence, clear, entirely clear. The eyes of a man whose mind had remained exactly what it had always been, even while the circumstances around it had been systematically dismantled. He had served in the United States Army as a specialist with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, Vietnam, 1970 and 1971. He had come home from An Khe Province with a combat infantryman badge and a hearing loss in his left ear that the VA had rated at 30% and that had worsened quietly over the decades until it was something closer to 50. He had built a life on the Keller property. He had buried a wife. He had maintained the farm. He had been, in every respect that Granger measured these things, a man who asked for nothing and gave back more than he took. Until a man named Harlan Briggs had become Granger County's Department of Veterans Affairs Benefits Coordinator. Harlan Briggs had held the position for 6 years. He was 51 years old, soft-spoken, with a reputation for patient helpfulness that he had cultivated with the careful attention of a man who understands that reputation is armor. He was the single point of contact between Granger County's veteran population and the federal VA benefits system. The person who processed claims, submitted paperwork, managed appeals, and communicated decisions. In a county of 4,000 people, with a veteran population of several hundred, many of them elderly and many of them rural, and most of them without independent access to the federal systems that managed their benefits. Harlan Briggs had a scope of effective authority that his official title significantly understated. He was not a powerful man in the way that powerful men are usually recognizable. He was powerful in the way that gatekeepers are powerful, invisible from the outside, absolute from the inside. Thomas Keller's disability benefits had been suspended 18 months ago following what Harlan Briggs had reported to the VA regional office as a failed address verification, a routine check in which a veteran's current address must be confirmed or benefits are placed on hold. According to Briggs's filed report, Thomas had failed to respond to 3 verification notices mailed to his address of record. Thomas had received none of those notices, because they had been mailed to the farmhouse that burned in 2004, an address that Briggs, as County Benefits Coordinator, had been responsible for updating in 2019 when Thomas submitted a change of address form. The form had been filed. The update had not been made. The notices had gone to a burned foundation. The benefits had been suspended. Thomas had called the county office twice. Both times, Briggs told him the matter was under review and that a resolution letter was coming within 30 days. It never came. Thomas called a third time and reached a voicemail that was never returned. After that, he stopped calling, because he was 71 years old and had grown up in a generation that did not make demands of institutions, and because there was no one else he knew to call. He had been living in the shed for 14 months. The farm had no power after the fire. It had a hand-dug well that still ran clean, and a woodlot that he could cut on the good days, and a small pension from a forestry company he had worked for in the 90s that covered his food with enough left over each month to buy firewood when he could not cut his own. It was not enough. It was what there was. He had not told anyone, because the particular pride of a man who has carried his own weight for 50 years does not dissolve easily, and because he had believed, through all 14 months, that the letter was still coming. Ethan sat with Thomas in the shed for 90 minutes that first morning. He sat on an overturned bucket, and Thomas sat on the single folding chair, and Diesel lay between them on the dirt floor with his chin on Thomas's boot, perfectly still, the way he lay when something had been decided and required only presence to confirm it. Ethan asked questions and listened, and did not rush, and did not perform sympathy. He had sat with enough people in enough difficult situations to understand that what they needed first was to be heard accurately, not consoled prematurely. He drove home and made 3 calls before noon. The first was to Monica Reyes, the director of the Montana Department of Military Affairs Veterans Services Division in Helena, who picked up on the third ring. Ethan had met her once at a county veterans outreach event and had her card in a drawer at home, which was the kind of luck that is not luck, but the accumulated result of a man who pays attention to who is in a room and what they do, and keeps the information somewhere he can find it. He gave Monica the name Thomas Keller, the benefits suspension, the address verification failure, the name Harlan Briggs, and the 14 months. Monica was quiet for 4 seconds. "This is not the first complaint I've received about Briggs," she said. That was the second detail that would stay with Ethan longest. The second call was to a veterans legal aid attorney in Kalispell named David Shin, who had been recommended to Ethan by a veteran at the outreach event who had called him. In the specific language of men who do not use superlatives, the best he had seen. David said he could file an emergency benefits reinstatement petition with the VA regional office within 48 hours on the grounds of agency error in the address verification process. He said the suspension would very likely be reversed within 2 weeks given the documentation trail. He said he would need Thomas Keller's original change of address form and any written correspondence with the county office. Ethan said he would have them to him by tomorrow. The third call was to a woman named Grace Tillman, who had been running the Granger Community Food Bank for 11 years, and who received Ethan's call with the practical, forward-moving competence of a person who has spent 11 years converting bad situations into manageable ones. Grace said she could have a delivery to the property within 2 hours. She said she would make sure it was enough for at least 3 weeks. She said, "Why didn't somebody tell me sooner?" in a tone that was not a question, but an accounting. Ethan drove back to the shed that afternoon with firewood in the truck bed. He and Thomas stacked it against the south wall of the shed, while Diesel inspected the perimeter of the property with the systematic attention he brought to new terrain, nose low, moving in the long, overlapping arcs of a dog performing a real assessment rather than a social one. The sky above the tree line had gone the pale pewter white of an approaching Montana winter, and the temperature was dropping, and the green wood smoke from the stovepipe was rising straight up in the still air. Thomas said, "While they were stacking wood, I figured the letter was coming." "I know," Ethan said. 50 years, Thomas said. "I never missed a check." Then one day the checks stopped, and the man on the phone tells you it's under review. He was not angry when he said it. He was stating a fact about the world, the same way he might state a fact about the weather or the firewood supply. He had not yet been angry. The anger would come later, in the clean, productive form it takes when the injustice has been addressed, and the person who suffered it has the safety to finally feel what they could not afford to feel when they were still inside it. That was later. Right now, he was stacking wood with a man he had met 4 hours ago, and a dog who had not left his vicinity since the door opened, and the immediate world was becoming slightly more manageable. Inside the County Veterans Affairs office the following Tuesday, Harlan Briggs arrived at his desk at 8:45 to find 2 things waiting for him. The first was an email from the Montana Department of Military Affairs Veterans Services Division, informing him that a formal compliance review of Granger County's VA benefits processing procedures had been initiated, and that he was to preserve all case files and correspondence pending the review. The second was Ethan Cole, sitting in the chair across from his desk with Diesel on the floor at his left knee. Diesel looked at Harlan Briggs. His ears went flat against his skull, and he made no sound and did not move, and the stillness he produced was the specific stillness that is more communicative than any noise. Harlan Briggs looked at the dog for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Ethan introduced himself by name and branch and rank, and told Briggs, with the complete, affectless calm of a man briefing a situation, that the Montana Department of Military Affairs had opened a formal compliance review, that David Shin at Kalispell Veterans Legal Aid had filed an emergency reinstatement petition that the VA regional office had already acknowledged, that Monica Reyes's office had identified 2 additional Granger County veterans whose benefits had been suspended following anomalous address verification failures in the past 3 years, and that the documentation trail in Thomas Keller's case, specifically the original change of address form bearing Briggs's initials and the VA regional office correspondence showing the address of record, never updated, was complete and in the hands of the State Division. "This isn't about you anymore," Ethan said. "The state is handling it. I'm here to let you know that Thomas Keller knows everything, and that every veteran in this county is going to know it too, and that the people who have been working around you because they couldn't figure out where else to go are going to have somewhere else to go starting today." He put a card on the desk, David Shin's number, Monica Reyes's direct line, and the number for the Montana Veteran Services hotline. "Anyone who comes to you from now on gets one of those, or the review finds out you didn't give it to them." He stood up. Diesel stood with him. Harlan Briggs had not spoken. He was looking at the card on the desk with the expression of a man whose corridor has just run out of wall. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. The Montana Compliance Review took 11 weeks. It documented processing failures in 14 of 31 active Granger County Veterans Benefits cases assigned to Briggs, including 3 cases where the same address verification anomaly had produced the same benefit suspension, the same pattern, the same coordinator, across 3 years. The state referred the findings to the Montana Attorney General's office and to the Federal VA Office of Inspector General. Harlan Briggs resigned in January before the referral became public. The federal investigation found the same pattern in 2 additional counties where Briggs had previously worked. He was charged in April with benefits fraud and deprivation of rights under color of law. The county benefits coordinator position was reorganized to require mandatory state-level secondary review for every suspension going forward. Thomas Keller's benefits were reinstated, with full back payment, within 18 days of David Shin's filing. The back payment was $11,340. Thomas used a portion to have electricity run to the shed. which he continued to live in because it was on his land, and the land was what mattered. He told Ethan, the week the check arrived, that he had prayed every night in the shed that a letter was coming, that he had begun to doubt, toward the end, not that God was listening, but that he had correctly understood what God was preparing to send. He looked at Diesel when he said this. Diesel lay on the shed floor with his chin on Thomas's boot, eyes half closed, entirely still. Thomas looked at the dog for a long moment, with the expression of a man arriving at an understanding he did not have words for, and had decided not to require words of. 4 months after the morning Diesel pulled Ethan off the road and into the trees, Ethan drove back to the Keller property on a Saturday in March, when the snow had pulled back from the south facing slopes, and the light was coming in at a different angle, and the tree line had a thin haze of green at the very tips of the branches. The kind that only people paying attention get to see before it becomes obvious. Thomas had coffee waiting on the folding table outside the shed door. 2 cups, and a third already poured into a wide bowl on the ground, where Diesel went immediately and drank without hurry. The shed's stovepipe put up a thin line of smoke, dry wood now. The smell clean and warm. Thomas sat in his chair and looked out over his land with the ease of a man who has stopped counting the days until something ends, and started simply living in them. Ethan's shoulder ached in the March damp. He drank his coffee and did not say much, and did not need to. Diesel finished his coffee and lay down between the 2 chairs, with his nose pointed toward the tree line and his eyes moving in their slow, ongoing inventory of everything that was present, and everything that was not a threat, which was, this morning, everything. Sometimes miracles don't come in the forms we can see from the road. Sometimes they require a dog to leave the path and walk 17 steps into a tree line and plant his feet and refuse to move. Because the thing that needs finding is not visible from where most people are standing. God does not always illuminate the hidden places with light from above. Sometimes he illuminates them with the nose of an animal who has no ambition beyond finding what is there and staying beside it until someone else can see it too. Thomas Keller had prayed every night for 14 months in a shed that nobody in town knew existed. And the answer had come on 4 legs through a pine forest on a Tuesday morning in November. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. Loyalty isn't a contract. It is a covenant. And sometimes the covenant that changes everything is the one between a man and a dog who decided, without words, that whatever was in those trees was worth walking toward together. If Thomas's story touched your heart, share it today with someone who needs to know that the forgotten are still being found. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you have ever known a veteran who fell through the cracks of the system that was supposed to protect them. We want to hear their story. Their name deserves to be said out loud. If you believe in stories of courage, in dogs who know what we cannot see, and in the kind of justice that starts in a shed at the edge of a Montana tree line, please subscribe so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and send someone down your road today who is willing to follow when the dog turns off the path.